Hi all. I want to invest a bit more time looking at the Chigorin system because I do think it's a very important example, at least as significant as previous videos you may have seen of mine about when I questioned how exploitable a night outpost is. You know, what makes an effective night outpost. Chigorin's asking the question with his Chigorin system, really, can you give up, the bishop pair and still get a good game? And in fact, it's a kind of hypermodern idea, giving up the bishop quickly. When White loses the knight on f3, d4 is obviously put under pressure here. Now this is a game I will go over in detail soon, but I just want to quickly emphasize something which occurred to me. That maybe Nimzovich was kind of influenced with the Nimzo Indian, because it's the same sort of principle that a knight is coming out quickly to take on c3, then to attack a central square, and sometimes there's b6 and bishop b7. But the Chigorin system is really, in a way, on the other side, the bishop coming out on the other side in effect. Perhaps that's a silly way of looking at it, but it's the same kind of principle. So in a way, he was a kind of forerunner of the hypermodern's, way of thinking. Anyway, okay, this is the game. In round 2, Laska playing White against Mikhail Chigorin. So we're taking the black perspective, the early bishop g4, kind of a forerunner in a way to some of the ideas of the Nimzo Indian, that Black's giving up a bishop quickly to put pressure on d4 later. In the Nimzo Indian, you're giving up this bishop for pressure on e4. There's kind of, it's on the other side of the board basically, like a Nimzo Indian. So bishop takes f3, knight c6, knight c3, now e6, solidifying d5. So Laska played e3, and now we see bishop b4. So even preparing to give up the other bishop. So with these bishop exchanges, he's getting a bit more pressure on the center, potentially, once these knights are being removed. So c takes, queen takes. This prepares perhaps fast casting queenside if necessary. So here, Black gives up the two bishops. So is this a kind of heresy against the Steinitz accumulation of advantages theory and getting the bishop pair? It's a complete rejection almost of the bishop pair. I don't like to use the word rejection. I'd rather say in context. In this particular context, can it be shown that these bishops will be ineffective? Well, it's actually quite a long game, but we're going to have to get, I think, to the key parts of the endgame, and in particular highlight how the knights, the environment for the knights is changed by Chigorin to make the knights very effective. So knight d8, seemingly passive retreat. Queen b5, offering the exchange of queens, which has to be taken. So now knight g6, okay, neutralising some of the pressure on the g file. He's also got to contend with some pressure on this b file as well. So he's got to reduce the dynamics of White's game. After castles, maybe, White should have tried to, smash open the bishops with f5, but he actually played king e2. Now rook c8, as though c5 might be played. So sometimes it's a good idea to play c4 and try and get a grip on d5 without the knight being dislodged. So if you can get a knight to d5 later, that would be very good, especially if f5 maybe is played as well. So rook g3. Now the move c5, rook a g1. Now we see c4. So the environment for a knight coming to d5 is starting to be improved if it can't be dislodged. Also we see that this bishop is potentially hemmed in. So bishop c2, f5. So definitely d5 is becoming an attractive square for a knight now. Bishop c1, rook f7. So much for the two bishops here. I think they're starting to be shown to be slightly less favourable over the two knights. So rook c6, and also because White's not using the b file, black has got now this c file to use well behind his pawn for this rook manoeuvre, so potentially hassling even a2. So white has to be careful. So rook a6, a4. The problem with a4 is locking in another bishop. So this bishop has got to be careful because all these pawns are on the same colour. But this bishop has also got to be careful to avoid, you know, too many pawns on white squares. I know that's technically impossible, actually, what I've just said. But both bishops are looking less effective than before. So we'll see now some interesting knight manoeuvres. Because here, because it's a closed position, it doesn't matter so much about time or the two bishops. Both of those elements are being put into a context which is not so favourable for them. So there's a kind of Taoistic understanding here that although you can build up, you know, a strategic list of elements, you can't routinely just apply elements. They need to be within context of the dynamics of the position. So Chigorin's really standing for that principle, that, you know, to individualise the position, not to take prescribed, you know, dogma or generalizations either from Steinitz or Tarash, but to look at the position, you know, for its own merits. And here he's really literally creating the environment which is beautiful now for the knights. The knight on d5 is wonderful. It can't be dislodged with e4, it can't be dislodged with c4. So we see now, although this rook looks a bit strange on a5, he's going to kick that bishop now, b6, and he's neutralised, you know, the counterplay on both these semi-open files. That they're also kind of useless for white. So it's really challenging this notion, you know, if it just because it looks as though there might be potential counterplay, you know, the question is there actual counterplay in this particular position? And he's slowly, you know, destroying white's counterplay. So where is this knight heading now? Probably to this square after knight d8. I mean, it can now maneuver like to f7 and d6. He does that actually. So f3, which is a bit of a committal move in its own right. So now knight f7. Now we see the move g5. So it's kind of paradoxical that black is opening up the position. But look at the two bishops; they're just awful. So black is really just maximising his knights even more, and in fact winning a pawn now, because temporarily a pawn up. Actually white plays e4, so he's even allowing f4 to drop if he has to move the knight. So f4 does drop, now knight h5. So why did he do this? I think he's basically undoubled white's pawn, so it seems a ridiculous thing to do. So he's even fixing white's pawn structure, but again he looks, you know, into the concrete of the position, and he's sealing things up again with f4. But maybe there's now more exploitable weaknesses, because that's one major reason. For example, this fifth row is now free to be used. With this next move, rook a5, the rook can majestically swing to the king side. So there's a check, king f8, rook a1. So the rook's coming over to the g file now. But it's cost quite a lot of time, this rerouting. And in the meantime now, these knights are preparing more sort of tricks up their sleeves. So rook c7, now knight e6, pressurising d4. Both knights are also able to go to g5 if necessary. So rook d1, knight e to d8. Where is this knight going? Is it going now to b7 to d6 potentially? Some question marks. No, it's actually going to c6. So after rook b5, white is actually losing a pawn, the a pawn, after rook b5. So why didn't he take on c4? Well, I believe knight d6 would attack that rook and win the exchange. So white's just losing that a pawn, but he takes that e5, but at a big positional cost now. The knights have their ideal sort of overprotection square. Knight f takes e5. Beautiful knight on e5 now, supported by the other knight. And this is starting to spell the end of white actually, because after rook dd5, black can afford to actually play rook a1 here. So the rooks are kind of infiltrating into white's position. Bishop d8, knight d3, offering a pawn, but if the rooks start coordinating against the white king, so c takes, rook takes, it's really dangerous now. So black has a kind of mating net, especially with this pawn on f4, stopping the king going to e3. check bishop g5 is a desperate move here, I believe, because now rook takes g5 and black is just a piece up with still a winning position. So basically Chigorin had just actually proved long before the hypermodern era of the Nimzo engine that how knights, the environment for them, and how semi-open files from the opponent are not necessarily effective. It really does depend on the individual features of the position. So really, you know, it's a kind of if the style was becoming what we call technique, this is very, very important for the evolution style, that we have this figurehead